You know that feeling when you feel pressure to kind of soften your beliefs, just to fit in? Well, the source we're digging into today says that for Christians, that's a losing game. It makes this really bold, almost confrontational case that it's time to stop apologizing and start standing firm. And this one quote? It's pretty much the heart of the entire argument. The idea here is that this isn't about your tone or being friendlier. The claim is that there's a fundamental clash of worldviews going on, and no amount of just being nice is going to bridge that gap. So how does the argument get there? Well, it starts by diagnosing what it calls a failing strategy, and it has a pretty fitting name for it: the unwinnable game. Here's the cycle it describes, and maybe this sounds a little familiar. You soften your words, you tweak the message, you try to be as reasonable as you possibly can, all in the hope of getting a little nod of approval from a culture that, this source argues, is never going to give it to you anyway. And what's really interesting is how this isn't framed as some new modern problem. The argument is that this exact tension was predicted from the very beginning. This quote is used as evidence that facing hostility isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. Actually, it's an expected part of the whole thing. And this leads to a very, very blunt conclusion. From this perspective, every little compromise is just another step down a path that's already crumbling. And the final destination of that path? Well, it's the total disappearance of the Christian worldview. Okay, so if trying to win approval is an unwinnable game, then why? Why is that? That brings us to the next really crucial point, which is called an offensive truth. And here is the major pivot in the argument. The source says the conflict has nothing to do with being mean. Instead, the offense is baked right into the truth claims themselves, because those truths, from this point of view, put a spotlight on things that people would really rather not look at. And this isn't just some vague idea either. To make the point really concrete, the source lists several specific and, highly controversial beliefs that it defines as non-negotiable. These are presented as the exact flashpoints where it's argued politeness just doesn't matter because the positions themselves are what modern culture finds unacceptable. So this sets up a really sharp contrast, right? On one side, you've got these teachings that are millennial old. And on the other, you have what the source calls this fleeting cultural consensus. Basically, social norms that it argues changed like 5 minutes ago. And so they just don't carry the same weight. All right, let's keep going and see how this argument builds. The source then zooms out and starts drawing parallels between today's cultural shifts and some of the most violent upheavals in history. It calls this section a warning from history. First example up is the French Revolution, and you can see the stated goals right there: liberty, equality, fraternity. I mean, sounds great, but the argument being made is that the method, this push for sudden, total, revolutionary change, is what led directly to chaos and the reign of terror. And next up, we see Mao's Cultural Revolution in China. And again, a utopian goal, right? A perfect equal society. But the method, according to this analysis, involved unleashing the Red Guards to just destroy all the old ways. And the result wasn't utopia, it was mass graves and horrific persecution. And all of this is building to the core contrast the source is making here. On one side, you have revolutionary change, which it defines as sudden, violent, and tearing everything down. On the other side, you have what's presented as Christian transformation, gradual, persuasive change that happens over generations, giving examples like ending slavery. So, after diagnosing the problem and laying out all these historical warnings, what's the actual solution? What are you supposed to do? Well, that brings us to the final part of the argument, the new posture. This new posture is broken down into 3 pretty simple steps. First, it says, stop trying to explain yourself to people who are just looking for a fight. Second, just let go of needing approval from a culture that's hostile to your views anyway. And finally, just say what you believe, clearly and without watering it down. And this whole posture is really anchored in the proverb you see right here. It presents this really stark choice. On the one hand, you have the fear of man, which is framed as literally walking into a trap or a snare. On the other, trust in the Lord, which is defined as safety. The implication is crystal clear. Seeking cultural approval is choosing to walk into the snare. And this all builds toward the argument's final point, which is all about changing where you get your validation from. This section is called Approval That Matters. So what's the end goal of all of this? It's about getting to an internal state of being settled and unmoved. The whole idea is to completely reframe the dynamic so that any anger from other people becomes their problem to deal with, not your problem to solve. And to really, really drive this point home, the argument leaves us with this powerful dose of historical perspective. It puts the life or death persecution of the past right next to today's social pressures, basically saying, hey, you can handle a mean tweet. And so, the entire argument, everything we've just unpacked, it all boils down to this one final provocative question. It's a challenge, really, that goes way beyond just believing something and pushes into action. It's simply asking, what does it actually mean to live like something is true?